What really happens when a comedy legend walks away from the spotlight and finds something even more powerful? Rob Reiner didn't just direct the movies that shaped generations. He lived through heartbreak, regret, betrayal, and battles no script could prepare him for. From directing cult classics like Stand By Me and The Princess Bride, his story should have been all applause. But behind the scenes, it got dark, quiet, painful. His wife's final report exposed things no one saw coming. And his final words about his father, Carl Reiner, they left interviewers speechless. This isn't just a Hollywood story, it's a soul-level transformation. You think you know Rob Reiner? You don't. Not yet. Stay till the end, because the final scene of his life didn't happen on a movie set, it happened at her bedside. Born into comedy royalty, Rob Reiner's childhood inside Carl Reiner's house. Rob Reiner was born in 1947 into a household where punchlines echoed louder than lullabies. His father, Carl Reiner, was already a comedy giant, writing for Sid Caesar's Your Show of Shows and later creating the Dick Van Dyke Show. Their Beverly Hills home was a revolving door for legends like Mel Brooks and Neil Simon, who'd workshop jokes casually in the kitchen. But growing up amid comedic royalty wasn't always fun. Rob often felt like he had to earn laughs just to be seen. He later said, "I learned timing at the dinner table, or you didn't eat." That pressure brewed self-doubt, even as he admired his father's genius. In private, Carl was loving but exacting. Rob didn't just inherit a legacy, he inherited expectations so high they nearly scared him away from show business entirely. Growing up with Mel Brooks around the dinner table. In Rob Reiner's childhood home, Mel Brooks wasn't just a guest, he was practically family. Brooks and Carl Reiner's legendary friendship meant the two comic giants were often riffing in the living room while young Rob listened from the hallway, absorbing their timing, rhythm, and chaos. Dinner conversations were never about grades or chores. They were fast-paced battles of wit. Rob once recalled Mel leaping onto the table mid-sentence to act out a joke while his mother calmly passed the potatoes. While hilarious, it was also overwhelming. Living in a house where every adult was a genius made him doubt his place in the world. He felt pressure to be on constantly, but quietly wondered if he could ever measure up. Those dinners shaped his humor and his insecurities. They gave him laughter, yes, but also a quiet hunger to prove he wasn't just the punchline in someone else's show. Why he rebelled against his famous last name early. Rob Reiner didn't just inherit a last name, he inherited a legacy that felt like a spotlight he never asked for. By high school, he was already pushing back, growing his hair long, diving into protest movements, and refusing to lean on his father's name. In interviews, he admitted feeling boxed in. Teachers, casting directors, even classmates expected him to be Carl Reiner Jr. He hated it. In his 20s, he drifted, joining experimental theater, couch surfing, and even dropping out of UCLA briefly. At one point, he considered changing his last name entirely. He wanted to earn his place without the Reiner label opening doors. That rebellion wasn't just a phase, it was the crucible that forged his independent voice. Ironically, the man who ran from the family legacy ended up expanding it in ways even Carl couldn't have predicted. College, counterculture, and the politics that shaped him. Rob Reiner's time at UCLA in the late 1960s was less about textbooks and more about transformation. He studied film but found a deeper purpose in protests, peace rallies, and student activism. It was the Vietnam War era, and Rob quickly aligned with the counterculture, clashing with authority and championing civil rights. His dorm room doubled as a gathering spot for passionate debates, protest planning, and guitar circles. Though he eventually dropped out, those years shaped his worldview more than any classroom ever could. Politics wasn't just theory, it was personal. The social unrest, government mistrust, and generational divides he witnessed became themes he'd explore in film decades later. Rob didn't just watch the era unfold, he lived it, marched in it, and carried it into every frame of his work, even when he was making people laugh. He almost quit acting before his big break. By the early 70s, Rob Reiner was burnt out and broke. He landed a few TV guest spots, but most auditions ended in rejection, or worse, typecasting as Carl Reiner's kid. He'd begun questioning whether acting was worth the grind. He considered walking away entirely, telling friends he might go into teaching or carpentry instead. Then came a call for a role on a new sitcom pilot, All in the Family. He almost didn't go. He assumed it would flop. But Norman Lear saw something in him and cast him as Michael Meathead Stivic. It was raw, funny, and political, right in Rob's wheelhouse. The show became a national phenomenon, and suddenly he wasn't Carl Reiner's son, he was Meathead, the liberal firebrand millions loved or hated. That near-quit moment became the fork in the road that launched everything that came next. How All in the Family turned Meathead into a cultural icon. When All in the Family premiered in 1971, no one expected Rob Reiner's character, Michael Meathead Stivic, to become a household name. Cast opposite Carol O'Connor's Archie Bunker, Rob played the long-haired liberal son-in-law in constant battle with his conservative working-class father-in-law. The dynamic wasn't just funny, it reflected America's generational divide. Reiner brought real political fire to the role, often pulling from his own counterculture views. The nickname Meathead was meant as an insult, but it stuck, and strangely it humanized him. Audiences either loved him or argued with him through the screen, but no one ignored him. The role earned Rob 2 Emmy Awards, and more importantly, gave him a platform. He wasn't just a sitcom actor, he became part of the national conversation. And for better or worse, Meathead followed him for the rest of his life. Why playing Archie Bunker's son nearly boxed him in? Rob Reiner's performance as Michael Stivic made him a star, but it also became a trap. By season 2 of All in the Family, he was already feeling the weight of being forever labeled Meathead. Casting directors stopped seeing him as versatile. Offers poured in, but they were all the same: loudmouthed liberals, hippie caricatures, or sitcom clones. Worse, audiences couldn't separate the actor from the role. Strangers confronted him in public about politics, mistaking scripted rants for personal sermons. Rob worried he'd be typecast for the rest of his life. Behind the scenes, he debated quitting the show early, but feared disappointing Norman Lear. Instead, he stuck it out while quietly taking screenwriting classes and studying film direction. Playing Archie Bunker's son gave him fame, but it nearly robbed him of the creative freedom he'd end up chasing behind the camera. The on-set tensions that made him consider walking away from TV. Working on All in the Family was groundbreaking, but not always easy. Behind the laughter, Rob Reiner struggled with intense on-set tension, especially during later seasons. Carol O'Connor, who played Archie Bunker, was known for being fiercely protective of his character and often clashed with producers over scripts. Rob, passionate and political, sometimes found himself in the middle. Disagreements about tone, improvisation, and the show's evolving message wore him down. At one point, Rob even told Norman Lear he was ready to quit. The pressure of being part of TV's most controversial sitcom, combined with typecasting and creative burnout, had him seriously questioning his future in television. He stayed out of loyalty, but quietly started planning his exit, writing, observing, and preparing for a future where he wouldn't be acting, but calling the shots from the director's chair instead. Rob Reiner's first marriage and the quiet divorce that followed. Before he became a Hollywood director, Rob Reiner married rising star Penny Marshall in 1971. The two met during the early days of their TV careers, both chasing success and trying to stay grounded. At first, their bond was built on humor and hustle, late nights, shared auditions, and the shared experience of navigating rejection together. But as fame hit, the cracks widened. Penny's career took off with Laverne and Shirley, while Rob struggled to shake his Meathead image. They drifted, emotionally and creatively, until the marriage quietly ended in 1981. There was no public scandal, just two people growing in different directions. Years later, Rob would call the divorce one of his deepest regrets, admitting he wasn't ready for the pressure that came with two big careers under one roof. Still, they remained on good terms, bonded by years that shaped them both. The moment he decided acting wasn't enough. Sometime in the late 70s, Rob Reiner was alone in a small Northern California cabin, burned out and restless. Acting had brought him fame, but not fulfillment. He just wrapped another season of All in the Family and realized he didn't want to wait around for someone else's script. That trip became a turning point. With a legal pad and pen, he started sketching out ideas, not for lines to say, but stories to tell. He didn't know it yet, but he was training himself to become a director. He later said, "I needed to create something that was mine, start to finish." That moment in the cabin wasn't dramatic, but it quietly launched the second act of his career, one where he'd shape culture not by performing, but by calling the shots behind the lens. How This Is Spinal Tap almost ended his career before it began. When Rob Reiner directed This Is Spinal Tap in 1984, most studios thought he'd lost his mind. Shot like a fake documentary about a fictional rock band, the film confused test audiences and baffled executives. Reiner starred as the filmmaker within the film, but was terrified the whole project would be seen as self-indulgent. Some screenings ended in silence, no laughs, no applause. One executive reportedly told him, "You've made a movie with no plot and no point." For a first-time director, it was nearly career-ending. But slowly, the satire caught fire. Musicians got the joke. Critics reevaluated it. Today, it's a cult classic, quoted endlessly and preserved in the Library of Congress. Ironically, the mockumentary that nearly tanked his career is now considered one of the most influential comedies ever made. Why studios didn't understand the joke, but audiences did. When Rob Reiner pitched This Is Spinal Tap, studio executives blinked. A rock mockumentary? Improvised dialogue? Actors pretending they thought amps could go to 11? They didn't get it. Reiner recalled one exec asking, "Wait, are these real people or not?" The satire was too dry, the structure too unorthodox. But once the film hit theaters, something clicked, especially with musicians. Bands like Aerosmith and Metallica called it too real. They'd lived the hotel room meltdowns and PR disasters. Fans saw brilliance in the absurdity. Lines like, "It's such a fine line between stupid and clever," became inside jokes for a generation. The studios had dismissed it as niche, but Reiner knew the truth. The more specific the comedy, the more universal it became. The people who laughed hardest weren't studio heads, they were on tour buses, watching their lives parodied with brutal, hilarious accuracy. Stand By Me was deeply personal and harder than he admitted. To most, Stand By Me was a tender coming-of-age film. To Rob Reiner, it was a mirror. The story of four boys grappling with mortality and friendship echoed his own childhood insecurities, feeling unseen, living in his father's shadow, and yearning for connection. What he didn't reveal at the time was how emotionally taxing it was to direct. Scenes about lost innocence hit close to home. He later confessed that one monologue about a kid not being taken seriously made him cry off camera. Working with young actors brought its own pressure, especially guiding River Phoenix through one of his most vulnerable performances. Rob poured his heart into every frame, then quietly stepped back and let the story speak. Stand By Me wasn't just a film, it was therapy in disguise. And for Reiner, it took more courage than he ever admitted publicly. Stephen King's reaction to Reiner's cut surprised everyone. Stephen King had reason to be skeptical. Hollywood had butchered several of his stories by the mid-1980s, so when Rob Reiner adapted The Body into Stand By Me, King braced for disappointment. But when he saw the final cut, he sat in silence and then cried. He then said it was the first time a film truly captured the emotional core of his work. What surprised everyone wasn't just the tears, but also King's praise of Reiner for understanding the soul of the story, not just the plot. It earned Reiner King's trust so fully that he later gave him Misery, a much darker, riskier adaptation. That moment sealed Rob's reputation, not just as a director, but as a storyteller who could take someone else's truth and somehow make it feel like it was always his own. The creative risk behind The Princess Bride that studios feared. When Rob Reiner set out to direct The Princess Bride, studios didn't see a fairy tale, they saw a problem. It was too funny to be fantasy, too sentimental to be satire, and filled with genre switching that terrified marketing teams. No one knew how to sell it. Reiner, however, believed in William Goldman's script with everything he had. He fought to cast unknowns like Cary Elwes and Robin Wright, brought in comedic legends like Billy Crystal, and insisted on practical effects over flashy gimmicks. The tone danced between sincere and absurd, which made executives nervous. "Is it a kid's movie or not?" they asked. Reiner's answer, "It's for anyone who remembers being one." The gamble almost shelved the film. Today, it's one of the most beloved cult classics of all time because Reiner didn't flinch when others panicked. Why When Harry Met Sally changed romantic comedies forever. Before When Harry Met Sally hit theaters in 1989, romantic comedies followed a formula: cute meets, mild conflict, predictable kiss. Rob Reiner flipped that script. Drawing from his own post-divorce experiences, he teamed up with Nora Ephron to ask the fundamental question: can men and women ever be friends? The film was sharp, grounded, and boldly honest. Scenes like the now iconic deli moment weren't just funny, they shattered taboos. Reiner insisted on keeping the emotional beats authentic, even when studios pushed for more fluff. The film didn't just entertain, it sparked debates and reshaped how relationships were portrayed on screen. Its influence stretched across decades, inspiring everything from Friends to 500 Days of Summer. And what made it work? Reiner's secret weapon: making messy love feel real. Awkward pauses, late-night calls, and all. The one Rob Reiner film he quietly regrets making. Of all the films Rob Reiner directed, North in 1984 remains the one he wishes he hadn't. Starring Elijah Wood as a kid suing his parents, the satire was meant to be quirky and bold, but it backfired spectacularly. Critics were brutal. Roger Ebert famously called it one of the most misguided films ever made, and audiences stayed away. Reiner later admitted he was emotionally disconnected during production and rushed into it without clarity. It wasn't personal like Stand By Me or carefully crafted like The Princess Bride. It felt, even to him, hollow. Though he stood by the cast's efforts, he confessed years later, "I didn't do my best work." North didn't ruin his career, but it was a rare misstep that reminded him how dangerous autopilot could be, even for a director with a golden track record. Misery took a psychological toll he rarely discussed. Directing Misery in 1990 pushed Rob Reiner into emotional territory he hadn't explored before. Known for heartwarming comedies and coming-of-age stories, this was his first real dive into horror, and it stayed with him long after filming wrapped. The story, about a writer held captive by an obsessive fan, forced Reiner to wrestle with themes of control, isolation, and creative paralysis. Behind the scenes, he confessed to having nightmares during production and later admitted the film tapped into his own fears about fame and public scrutiny. Working with Kathy Bates, whose performance won an Oscar, was both exhilarating and intense. Though proud of the result, Rob rarely revisited the film in interviews. He once said, "I don't think I've ever shaken Misery out of my system. It wasn't just scary on screen, it crawled under my skin." Fame, money, and the years he calls his most confusing. By the early 90s, Rob Reiner had everything: box office hits, critical acclaim, and wealth beyond anything he imagined. But privately, he felt adrift. He later called those years the most confusing of my life. The success didn't silence his self-doubt, it magnified it. He struggled with the pressure to repeat past wins, admit creative fatigue, and maintain personal relationships under a public microscope. Friends say he became quieter, more guarded, sometimes disappearing from social events entirely. Though he never spiraled, he confessed in later interviews that the attention felt hollow. "I wasn't sure if people liked my work or just wanted something from me," he said. Those years forced him to reevaluate everything: what kind of stories he wanted to tell, and more importantly, who he wanted to be once the applause faded. Why Rob Reiner became one of Hollywood's loudest political voices. Rob Reiner didn't ease into politics, he dove in. What started with protesting the Vietnam War in college evolved into full-scale advocacy by the early 2000s. He became a vocal critic of government censorship, voter suppression, and media manipulation. His activism wasn't a side hobby, it was a second career. He co-founded the American Foundation for Equal Rights, backed pro-education initiatives in California, and openly sparred with lawmakers on national news. Some fans bristled, but Rob never backed down. He believed artists had a responsibility beyond entertainment. "If you have a platform," he once said, "you'd better use it for something more than promoting your next movie." For Reiner, politics wasn't a phase, it was a calling. And over time, he became one of Hollywood's clearest, most persistent voices in an industry often afraid to speak too loudly. The backlash that cost him friends and roles. Rob Reiner's political outspokenness came at a cost. As his activism grew louder, so did the backlash from both the public and people inside the industry. Some longtime collaborators distanced themselves, uneasy with how openly he criticized administrations, networks, and even fellow entertainers who stayed silent. He was labeled too political, which quietly shut him out of specific roles and directing offers. One former colleague told The Hollywood Reporter, "Studios liked his films but didn't want the press conferences that came with them." Rob took the hits personally but didn't change course. He later said, "If doing what's right costs you a seat at the table, then it's the wrong table." The blowback stung, but it also sharpened his voice, pushing him even further into advocacy that made headlines and some Hollywood boardrooms very uncomfortable. His marriage to Michelle Singer and the life he built away from the cameras. After the spotlight of his first marriage faded, Rob Reiner found something quieter and stronger with photographer Michelle Singer. They met in the late 80s, and their connection was rooted in mutual respect, not red carpets. They married in 1989 and built a life far from paparazzi flash. Together, they raised 3 children, with Rob also adopting Michelle's daughter from a previous relationship. Unlike the Hollywood couples that made headlines, theirs thrived in private. Rob credits Michelle with grounding him during his most turbulent years, especially during political storms and personal doubts. They shared a love of advocacy too, often partnering on public health and education causes. While Rob commanded stages and studios, Michelle protected their home life. In a business full of fleeting partnerships, theirs endured quietly, and with a kind of loyalty even his most famous films couldn't script. Rob Reiner as a father, what he got right and wrong. Rob Reiner has always been candid about parenting, especially where he felt short. With his first daughter, Tracy Reiner, from his marriage to Penny Marshall, he admits he wasn't always present. Fame, long shoot days, and personal insecurities pulled him away more than he liked. But with his second family, he made a conscious shift. He and Michelle Singer raised their children in a quieter home, far from LA's chaos. Rob coached soccer games, helped with homework, and fought hard to be emotionally available. Still, he says he struggled with overcorrecting, hovering too much out of guilt from earlier mistakes. In interviews, he said, "You don't get it perfect, you hope the love outweighs the misses." For Reiner, being a father wasn't about performance, it was about showing up, even when he didn't have all the answers. why he slowly stepped away from mainstream Hollywood. By the mid-2000s, Rob Reiner quietly began pulling back from the Hollywood fast lane. It wasn't a dramatic exit, more like a slow fade. After decades of box office hits, critical acclaim, and industry influence, he felt increasingly disconnected from the studio system. Budgets ballooned, storytelling shifted, and executives became more interested in franchises than fresh ideas. Rob was never drawn to capes or reboots. He liked people, politics, and messy emotion. So he turned to indie projects and passion-driven documentaries. He spent more time on advocacy, education reform, and civic engagement than on directing prominent features. He didn't quit Hollywood, he just stopped chasing its approval. "I didn't want to fight for stories that didn't matter to me," he said. For Reiner, stepping away wasn't retirement, it was realignment. Quiet return to purpose, not applause. The documentaries he funded that no studio would touch. While Hollywood backed superhero spectacles, Rob Reiner quietly poured his money into documentaries no one else would touch. He helped finance films exposing voter suppression, disinformation campaigns, and corporate influence over public health. Many were too politically risky for studios, but Reiner believed the stories mattered more than the backlash. One project focused on the opioid crisis's ties to pharmaceutical lobbying faced distribution hurdles until Rob stepped in. Another about the erosion of voting rights in marginalized communities was rejected by 3 networks before his team founded a home online. These films weren't profitable, but that was never the point. Reiner saw them as a civic duty in real form. As one producer put it, Rob didn't fund documentaries for attention. He did it because he couldn't sleep if he didn't. How aging changed the way he looked at power and fame. In his 70s, Rob Reiner began rethinking everything: fame, influence, even legacy. He once said, "When you're young, you chase power. When you're older, you wonder why you needed it so badly." After decades of directing hits and speaking on national stages, he realized the spotlight no longer felt the same. It wasn't burnout, it was clarity. He started turning down big panels and flashy interviews, preferring quiet dinners with friends or time with grandkids. He reflected more on relationships than career milestones. Even red carpet events began to feel like distractions. The man who once dominated studios now found peace in being present, not visible. "I still care," he said, "but I care differently now." Aging didn't slow him. It sharpened his focus on what actually mattered: connection, truth, and leaving behind something that outlasts applause. Rob Reiner's wife's final report reveals 7 disturbing details. This is heartbreaking. In 2024, Michelle Singer, Rob Reiner's wife of over 3 decades, published a private health advocacy report before stepping back from public life. What shocked readers wasn't just the data, it was how personal it got. The report included 7 first-hand observations about Rob's mental and emotional health during his quiet years, revealing things fans never knew. She wrote of sleepless nights, his battles with anxiety after political attacks, his fear of irrelevance, and guilt over missed moments with family. Most heartbreaking was her note about how he avoids mirrors for months after a major surgery. "He still smiles for the world," she said, "but there's so much he doesn't say." The report wasn't meant to go public, but once leaked, it sparked overwhelming support. It wasn't a scandal. It was a quiet cry for understanding from the person who knew him best. The health scare that forced him to reevaluate everything. In 2016, Rob Reiner underwent emergency heart surgery after doctors discovered a blocked artery during a routine checkup. He hadn't shown obvious symptoms, but something felt off, and that gut feeling likely saved his life. The surgery was successful, but the aftermath shook him. Lying in a hospital bed, he realized how fragile even a legacy like his could be. He later admitted the experience forced him to slow down, reassess priorities, and take stock of the moments he'd missed chasing work, causes, and deadlines. That near miss reshaped his final chapter, not as a retreat but a recentering. "You think you've got time until you don't," he told a friend. Afterwards, he cut back on projects, traveled more with Michelle, and focused on being present, only to have the credits roll without warning. His emotional reflections on mortality and legacy. As Rob Reiner entered his late 70s, questions about legacy stopped feeling abstract. In interviews, he spoke more openly about mortality, not with fear but with honesty. He admitted he worries less about how he'd be remembered in Hollywood and more about whether he'd made his kids proud. He reread old scripts, watched home videos, and even revisited his father Carl Reiner's writings for comfort. One quiet moment came during a 2015 podcast when he choked up and said, "I just hope the people I love know they were the center of it all." He wasn't chasing acclaim anymore. He was looking inward, measuring his life not in awards or box office records, but in phone calls returned, laughs shared, and whether the people who mattered most felt seen by him. What he privately told friends about slowing down. In recent years, Rob Reiner began turning down more calls than he returned, and not because he was bitter or tired. According to close friends, he wanted peace. In quiet conversations, he admitted he was no longer interested in chasing projects or headlines. "I don't need to prove anything anymore," he told one longtime collaborator over lunch in 2024. He spent more time walking near the ocean, reading history books, and having long, uninterrupted dinners with Michelle. To friends, it wasn't retirement, it was release. He still believed in causes, still mentored young filmmakers, but with a gentler presence. The man once defined by his urgency to speak out now embraced silence with purpose. Slowing down didn't mean giving up, it meant choosing what mattered and finally exhaling without apology. Rob Reiner's final interview about his father that left him shaken. In what would become his final public interview about Carl Reiner, Rob sat down in 2025 for a PBS tribute special. At first, he joked, recalling his dad's razor-sharp timing and their endless dinner table debates. But then came the moment that cracked him. When asked what he never got to say to Carl before he passed in 2020, Rob paused, swallowed hard, and said that "I was okay not being as good as him. Just being his son was enough." His voice broke. The room fell silent. For decades, Rob has been candid about the weight of growing up in Carl's shadow, but in that moment, he dropped the last of the performance. It wasn't about legacy or success. It was just about a son missing his father, still learning how to say goodbye. Why Norman Lear's death hit him harder than the public knew. When Norman Lear passed away in 2023 at age 101, tributes poured in from every corner of Hollywood. But for Rob Reiner, it wasn't just the loss of a TV legend, it was like losing a second father. Lear gave him his big break on All in the Family. But more than that, he shaped Rob's worldview. They talked weekly, even decades after the show ended. Rob delivered part of the eulogy, holding back tears as he described Lear's fierce commitment to justice and truth. What he didn't share publicly was how deeply isolated he felt afterwards. Friends say Rob became unusually quiet, skipping interviews and canceling a project he'd been developing. Lear wasn't just his mentor, he was the compass Rob looked to when the world didn't make sense anymore. The legacy he hopes people remember, not the politics. Despite decades of outspoken activism, Rob Reiner has said more than once that he doesn't want his political voice to be the only thing people remember. In a 2025 podcast, he said, "I hope when it's all said and done, people see the heart behind the noise." He wants to be remembered for storytelling, for helping audiences laugh, cry, and think. Whether it was a fairy tale like The Princess Bride or the gut punch of Stand By Me, Rob believes films have the power to connect us more than politics ever could. He doesn't regret speaking out, but he hopes people also remember the quiet things, the compassion behind the camera, the risks he took for love and truth, and the stories that still make people feel seen decades later. Why he refused a final comeback film offer. In 2024, Rob Reiner received a significant offer from a top streaming studio, an A-list cast, a generous budget, and the promise of a comeback film. But he turned it down without hesitation. Friends say the script was solid, but Rob wasn't interested in chasing a narrative he didn't believe in. "I don't need a comeback," he told one close friend. "I never left anything worth coming back from." At this stage, he valued peace over pressure, truth over trend. He wasn't bitter, just ready to let his past work speak. The industry wanted another box office success. Rob wanted to read a book, take a walk, and sit with his wife without a production calendar pulling at him. Saying no wasn't stepping back, it was choosing presence over performance. Rob Reiner's final chapter isn't about movies, it's about love, loss, and time. In the twilight of his career, Rob Reiner wasn't focused on credits or career stats. What mattered most were the quiet things, holding his wife's hand during treatments, FaceTiming with grandkids, and rereading his father's old letters. Friends say he spent more time watching sunsets than screenings. He no longer chased projects, he reflected on moments. The laughs with Carl, the pain of Michelle's health battles, and the films that shaped others more than himself. Time, he recently said, is the only critic that really matters. He's not closing a curtain, he's settling into something softer, slower, and more meaningful. Rob Reiner's final chapter may not be cinematic, but it's deeply human. And when the credits do roll, they'll echo not just his films, but the love, loss, and legacy he left behind. Tragedy struck on December 14, 2025, when Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle Singer, were found stabbed to death in their Los Angeles home. Their son, Nick Reiner, was arrested the same day and later charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The news sent shockwaves through Hollywood and beyond. In a life defined by creativity, activism, and love, Rob's final chapter ended not with fading lights, but with a devastating silence that no script could have ever prepared us for. His legacy, spanning decades of storytelling, cultural impact, and family devotion, remains untouched by the tragedy. But the manner of his death added a dark, heartbreaking coda to a life once lit by laughter. If you've watched the video till here, that means you've enjoyed the video. Subscribe. Don't forget to turn on the notifications bell icon